Hello there, and welcome back to Daddy Rolled a One. I'm Martin, and this is another of my series of videos on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons, and one of the companies that published them, Tactical Studies Rules, later known as its descendant company, TSR Hobbies. Today we're going to be talking about the history of skills, specifically in Dungeons & Dragons, but also the evolution of skills in the tabletop role-playing game industry in its very, very early days. Skills were not part of the game. If you're new to Dungeons & Dragons, you might not know that, but they were not originally part of the game. And they have developed over time, not just from the creators from TSR, but also other game company publishers that were publishing things. TSR was watching what was going on, and eventually they come into the game in a few different ways. But the first time they're actually called skills in an advanced D&D type situation was actually in 3rd edition, which came out in 2000. And before that, there were some other names for them, and there was 2 different concurrent published games going on. In order to understand all that, I would highly recommend that you please watch my video on the history of D&D editions before you watch this, because I'm going to be referring to a lot of those editions, and it will help you to understand what I'm talking about as we go through. But let's just jump right into some history here. And this is just going to cover some of the main beats. But as we just talked about in the original edition of the game, there's no skills. So this is Men in Magic, which is how you create your characters. There's no skill listed in this particular version of the game. Your character is defined by their 6 attribute scores, by their species, or what we now call race, by their class, and then by their equipment. And that's kind of it. Everything else that you want your character to do as a player, you thought of that, and then you asked the DM, can I do this? Or what if I try this? And then the DM would make a ruling, and you trusted your DM, you worked with them, and your DM made a ruling, and then it was their job to then apply that ruling consistently moving forward. So you might ask, hey, can I jump off this table? Or whatever you're asking, right? And the DM has to consider the circumstances and usually would say yes. And so the default assumption in this game is that characters are competent. So it's very different from the way that skill systems work now, which is that your character has to have a skill to be able to do that thing. This game assumes that your character can do that stuff unless the DM has a reason to say not to. So there's no horse riding skill in here because you didn't need it. All characters are capable of riding horses. You don't need to make a check to see if you fall off your horse. You just do it. Now, the DM might say there's extenuating circumstances and might make a ruling that you have to make a check in this specific instance, and then would have to do that consistently moving forward. Same thing with swimming. You don't need to have a swimming skill to know how to swim. You just swim. The DM might say, oh, you're wearing armor, you're going to take a penalty or something like that. But the assumption is by default, your characters are competent and know how to do these things. So that's a difference between this version and a skill-based system, which sort of actually ends up limiting your character, because the more skills that are listed, you can't take all of them. So if you don't take a skill, most of these games assume that then your character is not skilled at doing that thing. So whether it's hiding or climbing or listening or whatever it is. So that's this game. 1985, though, just a year after this, a couple things happened. So Tunnels and Trolls is released. This is a completely separate, different role-playing game from Dungeons and Dragons. However, D&D was the only game that was out at this time. So it is very influenced and based on what D&D was like. So it's a class and level system, and there are no skills in the first edition of Tunnels and Trolls. But you also have the release of this game. I talk about this in my video on the history of the second role-playing game. So see a link here in the upper right-hand corner. But this is Empire of the Petal Throne. This is published by TSR. It is not a D&D supplement or a D&D game. It's its own separate game. However, the mechanics are based on D&D. It does include the same character classes, some of the same ability scores. But one of the really interesting things in this is that there is a skill system. And I talk a lot more about this in that video on the game. So you'll want to refer to that. But there's pages and pages in here of a skill system. This is only a year after D&D is developed, and you've already got a class and level system, which is adding skills to help define your characters. So that's very early on. Then in 1976, you have more games released. And in 1977, you have the release of this version of D&D. This is Holmes Basic. And this is levels 1 through 3. And once again, there are no skills in this, because this is really just a revision of original Dungeons and Dragons, just to make it easier for new players to understand. You also have the release of this supplement in 1977. This is First Fantasy Campaign by Dave Arneson. This is his home campaign of Blackmoor, published by Judges Guild. And in the back, now Dave Arneson has left TSR at this time, so this is not a D&D supplement, but he talks about special interests, which are things that your characters might do, what they can spend their time and money on when they're not adventuring, right? And so he goes into things, and these kind of end up being like skills, or it's interests that they might have. So there's wine. It's kind of ridiculous, but very much a product of the time. There's women, but there's song, there's wealth. But he talks about religion, which is kind of a skill in later editions of the game. And then hobbies, which are things like magic research, or things about raising and breeding of lycanthropes, or making torture devices, or making gold, or building flying machines. These are all things that your characters might be able to do that kind of help define them. So it is kind of like a skill system almost. However, 1977 also sees the release of Traveler. This is one of the first examples of a game that is not a class and level system of a role-playing game. It's part of the genre of role-playing games, but characters here are defined completely by their skills. So there's a skill system in Traveler. It's things like bribery and forgery, leadership, there's tactics, there's maintenance, navigation, like all this kind of stuff that you use to define your characters. And this is a real turning point. I really look at this game. It's probably not the only one, but it's really the biggest one. It's the one that's kind of had legs over the decades since it came out, to really delineate a point between a class and level type system like Dungeons and Dragons and a skill-based system. There are more different types of styles of role-playing games that you can play, but I'm going to be talking specifically just about class and level systems versus skill-based because it's relevant to today's topic. So Traveler comes out in 1977 as skill-based. Then in 1978, you have a game called Runequest, comes out from a company called Chaosium. This is a fantasy role-playing game. It's not a class and level system. It has this skill system that's really based around the idea of guilds. So there's guilds for alchemy, sages, thieves, armorers, mariners, foresters, horse masters, things like this. And that is how your characters sort of define as like what they're good at based on these kind of relationships that they make. So this is very early on from Chaosium, but we're going to see them come back here in just a few minutes. So also 1978 sees the release of the Player's Handbook for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So this is a concurrent game that's running next to that Holmes Basic set that you saw earlier, that blue box. This is advanced D&D, and there are no skills in here. Skills come kind of in this book. This is the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide. This comes out in 1979, so a year after this. And in this book, there's a section very early on in the upfront, and it's called Player Character Non-Professional Skills. And the idea of this is that your player characters are defined really by their class, and that's what they've been spending their time on. So if you had a fighter character, the assumption was you were working on getting good at fighting even before you became a first level fighter, which coincidentally is why in this game they use level titles of first level fighters called a veteran. It's not an early, like it's not a newbie. You're a veteran already at first level because the assumption is that you've been working at this for a while. However, he does go on to say there's some minor knowledge of certain mundane skills might be interesting to a player character, based on things that maybe they started even before that. So what he says is if you want to do that, you roll on this table. You don't get to pick. You roll on this table. It's a D100. If you roll 68 through 85, you don't get a skill of any measurable worth. If you roll 86 to 100, you get 2 skills. But the skills are things like there's armor, forester, gambler, miner, all kinds of things. Okay. These are really more like backgrounds than skills. And the way that you implement this is all right here in this tiny little paragraph. And it basically says the way you implement is that it's up to the DM. The DM has to create a situation for a player character to use these skills. And then the DM has to also then come up with how to adjudicate it, how to make a ruling to make that skill make sense. So that's it. There's your whole section on skills. You can tell it almost seems like an afterthought. They did include it. These are the official player character record sheets for first edition. And you see there's a section here for secondary skill. This is an early character that I had, a paladin, and her secondary skill was hunter. I can count on 0 hands the number of time that came up. So we put it down because it was on the sheet, but we never really used those. She definitely didn't get any benefits from being a hunter. Okay, so that's 1979. We're going to jump to 1981 now and the release of this game, Call of Cthulhu. This is by Chaosium, same company that made RuneQuest. And this is a full skill-based game of horror investigating. So there's tons of skills in here, and it's things like accounting and anthropology. There's charm is a skill. There's climb. There's dodge, disguise. There's Cthulhu Mythos, which you don't really want your character to get, but they're going to get it anyway, based on all the horrific things that they see. And so this is a skill-based game. And Chaosium has other games that they're publishing at the same time. Call of Cthulhu is kind of the biggest one, what they're really most known for. Runequest also, but Call of Cthulhu really, I think, is sort of their pinnacle of this game design. They end up taking the mechanics of these skill system games and writing a universal role-playing game called BRP, or Basic Role Playing, which is based on a percentile dice skill-based system. So that's 1981. Also in 1981, you have the release of this game. This is my first D&D product ever. My mom gave this to me as an Easter gift back in 1981. This is Moldvay Basic, so it's another basic version of D&D. And the basic rules cover levels 1 through 3. Okay, and then these are the expert rules. Now, this book didn't come in this box. I just keep it in here because it's just easier for me to put them together. This covers levels 4 through 14. We're going to look really quickly who wrote this. Dave Cook. It's also Steve Marsh, but for whatever reason, they highlight Dave Cook here. You're going to want to remember this gentleman's name. But we're going to flip forward to page 51. Saving versus abilities. Optional. The DM may want to have basic character's chance of doing something on his or her ability ratings, strength, etc. The player must roll the ability rating or less on a d20. The DM may give a bonus or penalty to the roll depending on the difficulty of the action, -4 for a simple task, +4 for a difficult one, etc. It is suggested that a roll of 1 always succeed and a roll of 20 always fail. So this is an early skill-based system that's based on just abilities. There's no list of skills. It's an ability check, just like skills in 5th edition are. Ability checks. This one just happens to be a roll under versus a d20 roll plus a bonus versus a target number. This is just roll your ability score under it to succeed. And then you'll see here it talks about swimming, climbing, and foraging. This is getting into that competency, and it just talks about like your characters are assumed to know how to swim. They're assumed to know how to climb. Only thieves can climb sheer surfaces, but any character can climb. Okay, so that's 1981. Now, in 1983, you have these sets come out. This is called the BECMI edition of D&D. This is a basic game. Again, it's a revision of the one that you just saw. This is by Frank Metzner. There are no skills in this game yet. All right. But now we're going to jump forward again to 1985, the release of this book. It's called Oriental Adventures. This is a book. It's a player's handbook, essentially, for playing D&D, but in an Asian style, Asian inspired, we'll say. And it's pulp or pop culture Asia, just to be clear. It's not, it's not historical, but it's by Gary Gygax. It says, but then it says with Dave Cook. And then if you read the inside, it says the design of this game is by Dave Cook. So what do we know about Dave Cook? Well, we just saw him in that expert book where he did that saving versus abilities. And if you turn to page 51 in here, there is a section on proficiencies, which are their weapon proficiencies. But then for the first time in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, we see this term non-weapon proficiencies. This is an extremely cumbersome way of saying skills. I don't know why they didn't just call them skilled, but they called them non-weapon proficiencies to distinguish them from weapon proficiencies. And then every character got slots for weapons, but also they got slots to put into non-weapon proficiencies, which are grouped into artisan, barbarian, common, and court. So these are proficiencies that gives you the base chance of success, tells you how many slots that you need. You're making d20 rolls versus a number to try to succeed. And that is technically the first skill system in D&D in published books is in this particular book. They then continue that with this book, the Dungeoneer's Survival Guide, which adds even more of those non-weapon proficiencies for the base advanced D&D game, and then also in Wilderness Survival Guide. So that becomes this faux skill system. This book comes out in 1986, okay, for advanced D&D. Then 1987, you have the start of the release of these books called Gazetteers. These are books about specific nations in what was called at the time the known world, which was the default setting for the basic D&D game. Later on in 1991, that world will be renamed Mystara. But now at this point of time, it was called the known world. And each one of these Gazetteers covers, again, a different nation. And as they go along, they start to also say, oh, well, here's some skills that you could have to make it clear that you're from these nations. So here's the Minrathad Guild book. This is Gazetteer number 9. And it talks about things like appraisal. And there's more skills in here than that, but this whole thing is about being merchants. And so that skill makes sense, right? So they actually use the word skills. So this is coming out in the late 80s. and early 90s. And eventually these are going to be collected into a book in 1991 called the Rules Cyclopedia. You see that here. And they take all these skills from all these different Gazetteers and put them into this book. This is the rules for the game of the BECMI edition, just without the immortals. That very last set, the I of BECMI, is not in here. So that was 1981. But we're going to jump back really quick to 1989. This is the release of the second edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Player's Handbook. So this is a new edition of the game. And let's take a look here, see who wrote this. It's our friend Dave Zeb Cook. So he created this. And so just by pure coincidence, there's a section here on proficiencies. It says they're optional. It's actually on the exact same page that it was on in the Oriental Adventures book. I think that's just pure coincidence. But he talks about proficiencies here, gaining weapon proficiencies, but then here's our non-weapon proficiencies. He also includes a section here on secondary skills if you want to use that system from the Dungeon Master's Guide from first edition, but he recommends using, the non-weapon proficiencies. And you see here they're grouped into general, priest, rogue, warrior, and wizard. This is your list of proficiencies. Okay, so it does repeat a little bit because you see like ancient history shows up in priest and wizard. Okay, but the list is pretty long. All right. And it gets even longer because this series of books is published for second edition. These are called the complete books. There's one for each class, and then they even expand the classes. So there was a complete ninja's handbook. There was a complete barbarian's handbook. Barbarian was not a class in this particular version of the game until that book came out, Barbarian's Handbook. But each one of them includes a section on proficiencies. So you see, this is the first one in the series Thieves. Look how many proficiencies are in here. And that's on top of the ones that are in here. Now, some of these are expanding what's in here, but a lot of them are just brand new. And then every book does that and adds new proficiencies. So that's second edition, 1989. These start coming out around 1989, 1990. Okay, we already talked about the 1991 Rules Cyclopedia. So I'm going to jump far forward now because nothing really happens with skills into the release of third edition. This is actually 3.5, so this is a slight revision to the third edition. This comes out in 2003. But you see that skills here on page 61. Look at this list of skills. Look how long this is. And it tells you for every class, whether it's a class or cross-class skill. It gives you the related key ability. Skills now, it's changing how skills work. In this particular system, this is where you start to get, it's a D20, add your bonus based on your ability, and however many points you put into the skill versus a target number, right? That's what you're trying to do. That was the big addition to this game, having this system baked right in. It's no longer optional. You're going to use skills, and this is your list, okay? This list is a little cumbersome. A lot of people thought it was a little too much. So then in 2008, you have the release of the fourth edition book, Player's Handbook, and there are skills in here buried at the back. There's a lot of reasons for that. We can go into that later, but here's your list of skills, and it's much tightened up versus what you just saw. They're starting to kind of group things together. So, you've got stealth instead of a separately hide and move silently, for example. So they work very, very similarly, though. It's that, D20 and add your bonus. And that brings us to fifth edition. Okay, 2014. And you have your skills in here that are part of your ability scores. So it's almost on the exact same page that it was in fourth edition. So you've got your list of skills, and again, they're based on your ability scores, and it's much tightened up. So this is actually kind of almost going backwards, which is what fifth edition was intending to do. So you see it's getting back to that original system that was developed way back in 1981 in that expert set, which is, rolling essentially an abilities score check. I know you're adding your proficiencies and all that kind of stuff, but it's getting back to that idea of just making an ability check to do things. So that's our look through skills and through the editions of Dungeons and Dragons. Hopefully you learned something. Again, maybe you didn't know that skills weren't always part of the game. I'd love to hear your comments on whether you think skills actually add to the game or whether you think they detract. And that will be it for now. So I would love to ask, if you enjoyed this video, please do like and subscribe to my channel. And as always, please share it on social media, which is the best way for me to grow my channel, and leave a comment below, as I just asked. And if you would like to support me, please consider buying something in my shop. There's a link in the show notes below. Thanks, and I'll talk to you next time.